Welcome to Nepal Now. I'm Marty Logan. How do Nepalis put up with this government? They're too patient, is a statement I've repeated regularly in the 15 years that I've been linked to this country. In fact, in 1990 and 2006, the people had enough and launched movements or revolutions that contributed to dramatic redesigns of the country. In 1990, the return to democracy, and in 2006, the creation of a republic that included Maoist rebels who had just signed a ceasefire. Earlier this year, a third movement was born after the Prime Minister, mired in a major crisis within his own political party, shut down Parliament. Like its predecessors, this movement signaled its arrival with street protests, but they were much smaller than the ones I remember from 2006, and this time, perhaps because of COVID-19, revolution was not in the air in Kathmandu. In fact, I only knew about the birth of the movement when someone tweeted it. But after speaking to today's guest from Brihat Nagarik Andolan, Bhaskar Gautam, it seems right that this movement is not bringing hundreds of thousands of chanting, banner-waving Nepalis to the streets. Yes, the previous revolutions were monumental, but somehow this movement's aim to create a fully participatory democracy with all of Nepal's citizens as equal partners seems a much higher goal, requiring not an explosion of people power, but a sustained, unrelenting push against the weight of history. Just a reminder that we're still recording remotely from home, so you may hear sounds of Kathmandu in the background, among them vehicle horns honking, dogs barking, and vendors calling. With that in mind, I'm slightly reluctant to ask for your feedback. Just kidding. As always, you can email me at marty@martylogan.net or share your thoughts via the Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter accounts of Nepal Now. If you haven't already, don't forget to like, follow, or favorite the show on Anchor, Apple, or Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, here's my chat with Bhaskar Gautam. Bhaskar Gautam, welcome to Nepal Now podcast. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Marty, for having me in this Nepal Now.
So my understanding is the citizens movement, or in Nepali, Brihat Nagarik Andolan, started in the middle of a recent political crisis after the Prime Minister dissolved Parliament. And now that crisis has been resolved following a Supreme Court decision to reinstate Parliament. So my first question would be, why is the movement ongoing if that crisis has been overcome?
Yeah, this is a very important question, Marty. Inside the movement, for people, citizens who have been leading it from the forefront or participating it in different capacities, there was this questions that, let's say the movement got triggered after the House was dissolved. So once the House will be reinstated, will the movement continue? Immediate answer will be yes, it will continue, and it has continued. But the question is in what capacity? So particularly in relation to movement, in 19 February 2021, there was the Citizen Manifesto which movement came up with. And the core idea of Citizen Manifesto basically can be summarized on, let's say, 3 points. One point was that as long as citizens won't be able to take the democratic process on their hand, the movement will continue, because the democratic process, particularly, let's say, since 2006 or even beyond that, has been very opaque. So democratic institutions are not functioning the way it should. So that is one thing, to get the process right. Second thing was basically, there has been kind of a regressive turn in many ways. To put it very differently, if we think of this whole agenda of state restructuring in Nepal, where the concern was that state will be much more inclusive and much more decentralized and federalized, that has not been the case in practice. So one of the core aspects of the movement will be to create an inclusive polity. So it is in that context, citizens movement is trying to have a sustained kind of a solidarity with lots of social movement that's ongoing in the country. And next is basically one of the challenges in Nepal in relation to democratic movement for marginal group has been that let's say Dalit issues are raised by Dalits, indigenous issues has been raised by them. It is similar with women's issues and other many more issues that is there in public, both in the forms of protest or critical engagement. So to make, let's say, to have a much more secular, inclusive, democratic space, there is a need for citizens to actually constantly engage and make our system much more inclusive, accountable, and transparent. So it is in that context, there is many issues that citizens movement is trying to embrace and move forward. So movement will continue in one way or the other.
Okay, so in that sense, it seems to be much different from the previous movements. I was here during the last movement in 2006. And if my reading of history is correct, those were much more in reaction to political events at the time. This one, as you described it, is much more broad-based, and it's much more, if I can say, focused on the systems, the democratic systems, and ensuring that democracy actually functions in more than just name. And I understand that. I think at the same time, I mean, it's extremely broad-based, and I would think that one risk of being so encompassing is that there's no single rallying cry or rallying point that would galvanize a very large number of supporters, rather than people who are always interested in these kinds of issues of democracy and good governance.
You are absolutely right. I mean, if we look back, particularly, let's say 1990 movement or 2006 movement, in 1990, the name citizens movement was not used then, but lots of independent professionals came and joined hand with the movements. But their agenda was slightly easier and clear. They were fighting for a regime change. So there was a call or move from, let's say, non-party political regime to multi-party political regime. So in one sense, I mean, what movement was trying to achieve was very clear in 1990. Even in 2005-06, what movement was trying to achieve was slightly more clear, because it was again connected with the regime change. So there were two clear agenda. The call for parliamentary forces was to come to democratic regime, I mean, Republican regime, and then particularly the call for Maoist was to leave violence and then come to competitive politics. Once the agenda of this parliamentary forces and Maoist was slightly more clear, citizens movement role was just to give it a push for a regime change. But after 2006, although citizens movement continued in one form or the other, it couldn't do much, because the challenge then was basically to make our democratic regime more democratic, to make it more accountable and inclusive. So it is within the systems that we are trying to we are trying to figure it out. But somehow it didn't click at that time. But when the house was dissolved now, this gave us an opportunity for people who were part of 2006 movement, and also lots of new generations of activists and advocates actually championing for the different kind of social justice cause from different locations, to come together and rethink that how we can make our system, democratic system, more accountable and more democratic. So this fight basically will be a long fight. So the movement for now is in early stage where it is trying to figure out. So it is evolving as well. So there might be a point, let's say after 2-3 months, where we'll be much more clear in terms of which will be our immediate targets, what will be our tactical priorities for the movement, and what will be our long-term strategy, given I mean, the kind of collective strength that we have.
Okay. Well, that's quite refreshing to hear, actually, that you're saying very frankly that we don't have it all figured out. We don't have the path plotted from A to B. There are a couple of recent events that the movement has been associated with. One at Kamal Pokhari, which is a well-known small pond or lake here in Kathmandu. Work had started to kind of, according to the municipality, improve it, modernize it. But the problem was that it was being done without respecting heritage issues and heritage values. And so some people went there, and from what I read in the media, basically destroyed, or at least symbolically destroyed, some of that early infrastructure that was being created. And there was another one around a road development called the Balaju, meaning another area in Kathmandu, the Balaju bypass, where people were protesting because houses had been destroyed and people hadn't been compensated. So those are two of the recent events that I saw your name or the movement's name associated with. Do you foresee that in terms of bringing together these disparate elements, people involved in social justice kind of actions, do you foresee that there will be more of this on the ground physical presence of the movement?
Absolutely, there will. There is this very dominant development narrative in Nepal at the moment, led by government, where it is very concrete driven kind of idea, where let's say infrastructures, road, or double-digit growth at the cost of environment, displacement, and destruction to heritage is at the core of it. So one thing that right from the beginning movement has, figure out in its protest, whether that be in early February, let's say when Balwata protest was happening in relation to Kamal Pokhari, or even in mid-February, February 19, where we went to this open Khula Turi Khel. So this whole idea of rethinking development or challenging the dominant or one only understanding of development is at the core of the movement, the citizens movement. For us, development and politics is not exclusive and independent of one another. It goes hand in hand. For now, the kind of development is very exclusive, displacement driven. It's not environmental friendly, and also it has been acted as a threat to both cultural practices or encroachment of land, or sabotaging lots of heritage in one way or the other. So this whole aspect of conservations, protection to land, ensuring lots of cultural rights, along with different cultural practices, is at the core of citizens movement. Basically, on the one hand, it is rethinking, let's say, excluded and marginal, this indigeneity and marginal politics in Nepal. And on the other hand, actually challenging the very dominant narrative of development that is very concrete, on a very, anti-environment, and also very economic focus, but without creating any jobs and other things. But if you have also noticed, let's say our last protest, which was particularly in Patan, the protest was a call for right to practice mother tongues. So we are also looking at other, let's say, fault lines, which is very anti-democratic in nature, which won't give space to mother tongue, uses, whether in schools or in other public arenas. So in that sense, we are also calling to rethink inclusive politics in Nepal to make it much more democratic in all possible ways that one could.
Right. Okay. No, in fact, I hadn't noticed the last protest. Obviously, the group won't be able to cover every issue, every so-called hotspot, in Nepal, let alone Kathmandu. And so I was thinking of other issues that have been at the forefront of the news in recent months. And I jotted down a few of them. One of them would be building of the fast track highway from Kathmandu down to the Tarai. Another is the rape and murders of Dalit girls and women. And a third one, which of course is much longer duration, is transitional justice. Are these the type of issues the movement would also get involved in? And because obviously you wouldn't physically be able to be at every protest, at every meeting, in terms of process, would it be that someone would contact you and say, can we associate the name of the movement to what we're doing here today or next week? And you would give your assent, and then in that way, some of these other activities, actions outside of Kathmandu would also fall under the umbrella of the movement?
It's a very important question, but let me step back. I'll come to your questions, but after clarifying one thing, let's say on a principle ground, If the idea is to actually, let's say, demanding we need much more inclusive and accountable polity, democratic polity, and we want very, let's say, decentralized government, and also we on the other hand basically questioning some of the core fundamental fault lines of undemocratic regime that has been historically in place. That's where that our 19 February manifesto becomes very important, basically to try to identify some of the key fault lines of Nepali, state, which has been bottlenecks or which has been acting as a hindrance for being unable to democratize it as per Nepal's diverse societal needs. Right. Back to the questions that you have asked. If we think of a Kathmandu-centric mentality, then the way development has been historically understood in Nepal and also resource has been redistributed in Nepal is very heavily Kathmandu-centric. And also it has not been feared to creating geographical disparities and other forms of inequalities in Nepal. So one thread of questioning is in relation to movement will be guided towards challenging that very dominant narrative, in which the thing that you mentioned about fast track and other things comes, which is also seen as a threat to displacement, heritage, environment, and other things. So we'll be questioning that in as and when needed, and in places where, let's say, it has been heavily concentrated. So one area which has been heavily concentrated is, larger Kathmandu Valley, and Kokona is one point, that you have mentioned, where, let's say, 6 national projects will go through that region. Which will create lots of ecological, climatic destructions, environmental threats, and displacement in that region. People from Kokona are already part of this movement in many ways. Next is basically you raise the question of rape and other thing. So let's say, we have also done independent women's march. That was in basically questioning some of the Brahminical patriarchy, impunity that is very much entrenched in the systems, and rape culture that is flourishing, and let's say police and other institutions that has not been able to do even the basic investigations and things, which is again connected with ensuring rule of law and justice. So it is in that connections, rather than jumping and running around lots of events, basically questioning that very fundamental structures and demanding reform of it. In some places, maybe movement will be able to take initiative and do lots of activities and protests on their own. In other places, as you said, initially, as I said in your earlier questions, given this is evolving, it will take some time basically to figure out our long-term strategy, our collective strengths, and also our short-term tactical priorities. But there has already been some of the initiatives in the directions that you have indicated. For example, last week, some 10 days back, in eastern regions, in this Kosi River basin, where particularly there's one point called Khalun, where 4 rivers meet. So there is one very big rock which is at the convergence point of those 4 rivers, which has been, historically mentioned in the oral traditions of indigenous people, Mundum, and then that place is worshipped. But Chief Minister of Province 1 and Prime Minister basically are keen to replace that stone and then create that as a voting station center. So some of the, indigenous activists from that region, so we are also connected with citizens movement. Basically, they talked to us and said, whether can we use this banner, because we want to, link this with the larger citizens movement. So there was one protest taking place in that regions. So this kind of spontaneous activity will definitely take place, and that is also not far from, again, questioning very dominant development practice on one end, and also on the other end basically rethinking of indigenous rights and other rights that goes together with the way things are being practiced. But then beyond that, let's say there is also caste structures or caste dominated fault lines, or again very what we call Kathmandu-centric mentality and that kind of fault lines, or basically this whole dominant Pahari hill caste versus indigeneity fault line, and this Brahminical patriarchy versus, this whole, how gendered is Nepali politics in many ways. So if we think of these fault lines, then our social justice call or struggles, and also our demand to make our polity more inclusive and accountable is connected with, questioning and challenging fault lines. And so if whatever we do, both in terms of our process thinking and activities, can question some of the core structures that is entrenched and is acting against the, let's say, diversities of Nepali society, or against the democratic aspirations and hope of Nepalese people, then I think this movement, both in its short terms and long run, will contribute to the kind of democratic regime that we are looking for.
Okay, that really helps to clarify, I think, how it will or how it may the movement end up working. And by the way, I really like that phrase, that word, fault lines. I think for me, it really does resonate and helps me picture some of the possible issues that the movement could be working on. I think it's very evocative as a term. I wanted to ask you also, you touched on it a bit in terms of representation, and I'm thinking, who does the movement itself represent? And you've mentioned already a couple of issues around Indigenous rights and working with Indigenous people in the East. You mentioned the Women's March as well. But for the movement itself, when I think of the movement, and when I actually went and was looking for information about the movement, I found your name, I found you, and names of other men who are involved in the movement, Ryan Wagle and Kagendra Sangrola. So far from what I could see, the leaders, if you can call them that, of the movement, or the faces of the movement, are men from so-called higher caste backgrounds. Can you tell me a little bit more about who is leading or who is representing the movement, and who you would like to see in those roles?
Yes, these very important questions, and also a challenge in itself. So basically, when the House was dissolved, Yug Pathak started calling people. He's a writer who has been, active particularly since 2006, who has emerged after 2006 in a public landscape as one of the public intellectual, and has been involved with a number of issues. So the point I'm trying to make is that why was it that particular person who started calling people to rally around and protest? So why not it was somebody else? So let's say Mr. X or Miss Y or Miss Z. So if we see that way, then obviously there is a limitations from where the movement began, from the point where movement Yug Pathak started making calls to galvanize the movement, right? So if we see that way, then he started calling, it's his immediate context, or people whom he thought will contribute to this process. And the evolution of this process itself is a constraint to see that it will take some time, or it will take a while before this movement will expand and lots of faces from different backgrounds will come and lead. But they should come and lead. So that's the point I'm trying to make. Beside that, let's say the name that you have mentioned, Narayan Wagle or Kagendra Sangrola, or with the name that you didn't mention, but who is in the forefront or who has been acting as a spokesperson, Sanjeev Uprethi or myself and other friends. Of course, these are all, looking at their surnames, come from a particular caste background. But while these people came in the forefront and leading this movement, there are also lots of people who have been in social justice or social movement for a long time. So I can name many friends, let's say J.B. Vishwakarma and Santosh Pariyar, who are Dalit activists, Kailash Rai and Dovan Rai, who comes from IP's indigenous people background. So if you see that way, there are also other many faces who have been in the forefront, vocal and speaking. And also, but still, as I pointed out earlier, and it will take some time before this group evolves and comes into full phase. And one of the things that we have been internally discussing is that, there has to be a core of, loosely, let's say 15, 20 people, which need to be as inclusive as one could make it. But in relation to people who have been already participating in this movement, this is, let's say, internal side of the movement. But let's say if we see its appearance or its external side in terms of its content and avenues it has created and who has come and joined hands as in speakers or poets and other things, then it has been one of the most diverse avenues for people, who have been historically part of lots of social justice struggles, and also new emerging talents will be and who will eventually be part of lots of social justice struggles in months and years to come. And it is glad that this group has come out to take up this challenge with certain kind of awareness, but that is not enough. So more and more debate from different social movement or different locations, both caste, gender, geographical and other locations, to questions that movement will be very historically important in the days to come if this movement really want to galvanize and move forward. We need to have more and more faces from different backgrounds so that movements becomes much more inclusive, but not inclusive at a face value, inclusive in terms of its content, ownership, and also bringing new kind of sensibilities to the movement. That is more important, is what I will say. And once that happens, I think the prospect for the citizens movement to thrive in and also set a new path way, particularly to let's say to set an example where within a democratic regime also one could have a sustained citizen movement that could make our system much more accountable and just will actually set a different standard. And this is a time where we need to set a different standard right from the beginning, so that more beyond faces, actually the movement becomes inclusive really in terms of ownership, content, sensibilities, and everything that could be there.
Okay, and just to take that point forward a little, would you suggest people, let's say there is an organization representing a certain LGBT group of people, would you suggest to them that they reach out to you and see how they can somehow link their advocacy with the movement so that they could also operate under the banner of the citizens movement? And the second related question would be, would it be important to do something such as when the media calls you up or calls up Narayan for an interview, to give them the name of someone else, a woman who was involved in the Women's March, or, someone who's not in what I see as the core group up until this moment, in order to kind of push that point forward rather than to let it organically happen?
I think there has to be attempts or activeness from multiple fronts. Before answering to your questions, I would like to clarify one more point. That is, if we think of both organizational and other structures of citizens movement, right from the very first day, I was not actually present in first few meetings because I was in Brihat Nagarik, but right from the very first few meetings, based on my conversation with the friends, is that the movement has to be as loosely networked as possible. No organizations or organization structures should take place, whether in terms of any core committee or other forms of committee. And it should be based on, let's say, individual donations and not organizational support. And whoever comes to this, whoever becomes a part of the citizens movement, when they come to the citizens movement, they need to come in the individual capacity, not as an organization, not as a representative of some organizations, but as a citizen, right? But citizens collective it could be. So if we see that way, then basically this will be one of the different kind of a group that will evolve, where there will not be any, let's say, coordinators, conveners, or spokespersons, or any core committee. That's why I think I was constantly referring to how things have evolved, because this is a voluntary thing. After, say, 7-10 months, somebody's energy might dry up, and then they might not necessarily want to be part of this movement because of their other commitment connected with their, let's say, livelihood or family or offices or what have you. So if we see that way, then this is kind of a loose group that has voluntarily emerged and evolved. and it should not take any organizational form. Of course, it should be collectively organized for its larger cause, but not having any, let's say, specified or organized core. In that sense, the group is itself very open, and people who want to join hands can actually come and join hands. And there are lots of, let's say, informals or formal conversations going on with different activists, and I mean people who are associated with different movements, that I mean we need to work together. So that's one aspect of it. And other is what you have said, is that there has to also be, let's say, both public and other forms of call, where uh, groups, I mean sexual minorities or other minorities, or let's say even groups that has been in one way or the other been part of other forms of democratic struggles in the country, could possibly join hands together, sometime being the internal core or larger part of the movement itself, or other times maybe basically having in their independent struggles, but with all the opportunities where they could also see that there are avenues where we could collectively join hands and look for a sustained kind of a solidarity, where lots of converging points or common cause could go together simultaneously. So it is not at the cost of other movements, but that movement could do its things on its own, but lots of things where there are common points. Because some of the movements, let's say squatter movements and heritage movements, are in conflict with one another, but we as in citizens movement think so there are some basic common points between the two that can be collectively raised from citizens movement as such.
Yeah, as you're speaking and I'm thinking about it, it does seem like a huge challenge to bring, as I said earlier, to bring together such disparate elements with such different backgrounds and experiences, and still not to do it, not to be creating a new organization as such, not to knit it tightly, but to allow some room to flow, right? People kind of ebb and flow depending on the issue, depending on sometimes the interest even. And I can see again why that would take so long to develop as well.
Yes, the key challenge is that in next few weeks, we need to be very aware with lots of rethink, internal reflections, and thinking that what is our collective strength, what is that within our capacity that we can push through or we can fight for, and so that it will, let's say, we won't get, I mean, fizzle out, or our voices won't get scattered all over the place, so that we will be unable to hit where we need to hit. So this I mean the challenge to find a fine balance, some kind of immediate or short-term results and goals are also equally important. For that, lots of strategic thinking, I mean, has to go immediately within the group, and also need to be part of a larger debate. I think we are thankful that, let's say, if we see medias, particularly vernacular press, then there has been a serious concerns. There has been lots of comments. So citizens movement has been one of the reference point for lots of debates that's happening. So that is helping us to think through about some of the larger challenges associated with Nepal's, I mean, democracy. But also, it has also been helping us to think through that what is that we can do, and what are our constraints or limitations that we need to be very much aware of right from the beginning.
So are you saying, if I kind of read between the lines, are you saying that maybe you sense some people losing patience, that the movement is not more focused on a particular goal?
It might happen. It might happen because particularly in last 10, 15 years, since 2006, if I put it that way, then there has been lots of disintegrations, frustrations, hunger or concerns for immediate output. And also the way, let's say, digital engagement is emerging. We are also, this attention span is very short, and also we are looking for very quick results. So let's say if this movement won't come with certain kind of a clarity in terms of what it is fighting for, and what it can, let's say what kind of changes it could bring about in both short run or medium term or long run. And if that clarity won't come out in, let's say, within a month from now, then lots of questions from all directions, both within and outside, will emerge, which we might not be in a position to answer. So the challenge, so sense of urgency is also equally there in terms of, I mean, what should be our focus, and let's say how can we also be as encompassing as possible, but without losing our focus. So this balance, I think, will be crucial.
Okay, that's clear. And as I said before, it's a very big challenge, but it's actually, to me, it's quite exciting. To put it simply, there's lots of room for change and progress in Nepal. And there's so much potential, I guess, is another way of putting it, in my perspective.
Yes. Thank you, Mati, for having me. And also, I hope, I mean, we'll be able to achieve something collectively and set a different standards for ourselves and also for the generations to come. Let's see.
Well, thank you, Bhaskar. It was really good talking to you, and I understand the movement better. And I'll certainly be watching in the future to see how it progresses, and hopefully be speaking to someone from the movement again in the not too distant future. So thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you. Same here. I also enjoyed a lot, and also it was a great opportunity for us to share something and to clarify a few things as well. Thank you.